I now have all the knowledge I need to write this complete script. Let me produce the full 72-paragraph TTS-ready script. There is one moment every human being is moving toward, but almost no one is prepared to face it. The final breath. The silence after the body stops. The instant when everything you called your life begins to fall away. And according to ancient death teachings, that moment is not empty. It is a threshold. What if death does not simply erase you? What if it reveals you? Not the name you carried, not the body people recognized, not the identity you defended, but the awareness beneath all of it. The ancient book we are about to open does not treat death as the end of consciousness. It treats death as the final mirror. And the most disturbing part is this: what appears after death may not be something foreign waiting for you. It may be everything you refused to face while you were alive. Your fear, your attachments, your longing, your unfinished love, your hidden light. So before we ask what happens after death, we have to ask what inside you is still afraid to be seen. In this video, we are going to open one of the most significant death teachings ever recorded in human history. We are going to explore what this ancient book describes as the stages of dying, the dissolution of the body and mind, the appearance of luminous visions, the pull of old fears, the possibility of liberation, and the force of attachment that may drag consciousness back into another cycle. These are not fairy tales. These are symbolic maps drawn by people who spent lifetimes studying the interior of human experience. And what they documented is both older and stranger than most modern minds are prepared to receive. But this video will not stop at the boundary of death itself. Because the most radical gift hidden inside these ancient teachings is not a blueprint for the afterlife alone. It is a blueprint for the life you are living right now. Every major teaching about dying that this ancient book contains is, at its core, a teaching about waking up. A teaching about how to live. About what it means to be conscious, present, unafraid and free while you still have breath in your body. So if you have ever felt the quiet weight of your own impermanence pressing against your chest, if you have ever lain awake wondering what any of this means, if you have ever lost someone and felt the cold strangeness of a world that simply kept moving, then this video is for you. Stay with this. What we are about to open is not comfortable, but it may be exactly what your awareness has been waiting for. Most of us have been handed exactly two options when it comes to understanding death, and neither one of them actually resolves the deep unease we carry. The first option is the scientific materialist view, which tells you that death is total biological shutdown. The brain stops. The signal goes dark. There is no experience, no awareness, no continuation. You simply cease. This view is presented as rational, modern, and honest. And for many people, it functions as a kind of intellectual armor. But notice something. Even people who fully accept this explanation still feel fear when they think about dying. The armor does not actually stop the trembling. The second option is the one most religious traditions offer. Death leads to a simple, comforting destination. Heaven, paradise, a reunion with loved ones in a place without suffering, peace waiting at the end of the road. This view offers warmth and consolation, and for millions of people, it carries real meaning. But notice something again. Even deeply religious people often feel fear when death comes close. The comfort story does not always quiet the shaking hands. Because both views, Whether they lean toward nothingness or toward guaranteed peace are still attempts to resolve the radical unknown. And the radical unknown does not dissolve that easily. What the ancient book we are going to explore today refuses to do is flatten death into either of those two shapes. It does not tell you death is simply the end of everything. And it does not tell you death is a smooth elevator ride into permanent happiness. What it does instead is far more unsettling and far more honest. It says death is a process, a dynamic, conscious, and deeply revealing process, one that unfolds in stages, one that the mind participates in, one in which who you have been and what you carry inside you is not left behind at the door. It comes with you. This ancient teaching treats death the way a skilled navigator treats a storm at sea, not as an annihilation, but as a crossing. And the quality of that crossing, according to these traditions, is directly shaped by the quality of the awareness you bring to it. Which means that how you live, how awake you are right now, how honestly you relate to fear and attachment and identity, all of it matters. Not just for the life you're in, but for the threshold that every living being is inevitably moving toward. There is a particular silence that falls over a room when death enters it. Not just the silence of a body that has stopped, but the silence inside the people standing around that body. The silence of not knowing what to say, not knowing what to think, and not knowing what to believe. And most of us fill that silence as quickly as we can, because sitting inside the unknown for too long feels unbearable. So we reach for the nearest story, the nearest explanation, the nearest map that fits our current worldview. And for a large portion of the modern world, that map says, when the brain dies, the person is gone. Full stop. Nothing persists. There is no experience after the last heartbeat. What feels like a self was only a biological process. And when that process ends, the self ends with it. This view is deeply held, often genuinely, by people who value scientific thinking and distrust superstition. And it is true that much of what we call consciousness does appear to depend on the functioning brain. When the brain is damaged, experience is altered. When chemistry changes, perception changes. The evidence that the mind is connected to the body is real and cannot be dismissed. But the leap from there to absolute certainty about what happens at the moment of death and immediately after it is a much larger leap than science has actually taken. The honest position at the very edge of biological knowledge is not certainty. It is a question mark. And that question mark is where this ancient book was written. On the other side of the cultural divide, there is the view that death is the beginning of a better chapter. That a loving force of some kind waits to receive the soul. That heaven, or paradise, or some equivalent destination exists, and that good people arrive there. This view has extraordinary power. It has comforted billions of people across centuries, and it carries genuine beauty. The idea that love does not simply stop at death, that connection survives the grave, that something continues, this is not a foolish idea. Every great spiritual tradition in human history has held some version of it. And the people who have had near-death experiences across radically different cultures and belief systems often return with something that resembles this: a sense of continuation, of light, of presence, of love that does not end. But here is where both maps begin to show their cracks. The person who is certain that death is total nothingness, and the person who is certain that a comfortable heaven is waiting, share something in common. They are both certain. And certainty, when it comes to the most radical unknown in human experience, is almost always a psychological strategy rather than a genuine conclusion. Certainty is the mind's way of not having to feel the full weight of not knowing. It is a way of putting a wall between you and the abyss. And the abyss does not care about your wall. What neither of these common explanations addresses is the specific texture of the fear that most people carry around death. Because most people are not primarily afraid of the mechanics of dying. They are not lying awake calculating the cellular process of biological shutdown. They are afraid of something far more personal. They are afraid of what remains unfinished. They are afraid of the love they never fully expressed, the life they never fully lived, the things they said that they cannot take back, the things they never said that they should have. They are afraid that whoever they were was not enough, and that the ending will arrive before anything can be corrected or completed. This kind of fear is not answered by a neuroscience lecture, and it is not answered by a simple promise of heaven. It is a deeper wound. It is the fear of a life half inhabited. And it is this exact wound that the ancient book we are about to explore speaks directly into, because the traditions that produced these teachings understood something crucial. The fear of death and the fear of an unlived life are the same fear. They are two faces of one hidden pattern. And until you see both faces clearly, neither the science nor the religion will actually set you free. The reason the standard explanations for death fail to dissolve the fear is that they treat fear as a problem of information, as if you could simply be told the right answer and the trembling would stop. But fear of death is not primarily an informational problem. It is an existential one. It lives in the body. It runs through the nervous system. It shows up in the chest as a tightening, in the throat as something unspeakable, in the middle of the night as a sudden cold awareness that time is limited and you are not ready. And no amount of intellectual argument, no matter how convincing, reaches that place. Because what the fear is really protecting is not a question about death at all. It is a question about whether your life has meant something. Consider what people say when they reflect on death, not in abstract philosophical conversations, but in the real moments. When someone they love is dying, when their own body signals something serious, when a random event strips away the assumption that they have unlimited time. In those moments, the conversation almost never goes toward neuroscience. It goes toward faces, toward words that were and were not spoken, toward moments that feel wasted, toward people who were loved and people who were wronged, toward the particular shape of a life and whether that shape was what it could have been. The fear of death pulls back the curtain not on dying itself, but on the way you have been living. This is why near-death experiences fascinate so many people across cultures, across centuries, across belief systems. Because the people who have them almost never come back saying they have proven nothingness or proven heaven. They come back saying something more personal, that they felt completely known, that they saw their life as if from outside of it, that what mattered was not what they had accumulated, but how they had loved, that they were not judged by an external force so much as they saw themselves with perfect clarity, that the love they had given or withheld was visible, that regret and tenderness arrived simultaneously. And these people overwhelmingly come back changed, not because they received a new theology, but because they encountered themselves without any of the usual hiding. And this is the pattern that persists. The grief people feel around death is not simply grief about absence. It is grief about incompleteness. The widow who cannot sleep is not only missing a physical presence. She is wrestling with everything that was and was not said. Everything that was held back. Everything that could have been different. The adult child standing at a parent's grave is not only mourning a person. He is confronting his own mortality, his own unlived urgency, his own sense that time was wasted on arguments that no longer seem worth anything. Death does not simply end a life. It illuminates it. And what it illuminates is often what we were most afraid to look at. The ancient traditions understood this. They built their death teachings around this exact recognition, not to terrorize people and not to comfort them with empty promises, but to say clearly, the way you relate to your own mortality while you are alive determines everything. What you cling to, what you deny, what you are willing to see, and what you are not. These are not metaphysical questions floating somewhere above your daily life. They are the architecture of your daily life. Every avoidance, every half-lived moment, every relationship held at a safe distance, every dream deferred for a more convenient future, all of it is built on the buried foundation of unacknowledged death. The fear is not sitting in some faraway corner of your experience. It is shaping the room you are already living in. And this is why the shallow explanations fail. Because they address the surface of the fear without ever descending into its roots. The root of the fear of death is not really about what comes after. It is about what was left behind, what was left unfinished, unexpressed, unfaced. Until that root is touched, the fear does not move. It simply shifts its shape and shows up again in a different disguise, in anxiety, in numbness, in the relentless need to stay distracted, in the life lived at half volume, because full volume might lead to a loss so painful it seems better never to have loved that completely. If this has already reached something inside you, if the weight of this subject feels personally familiar, if you have lost someone and the strangeness of it is still moving through you, or if your own mortality has been quietly pressing against the walls of your awareness, I want you to write something in the comments right now. Write, I face the threshold, not as a performance, but as a recognition, a small act of honesty between you and yourself in this moment. The people who are watching this video are not casual observers. They are people who can feel the gravity of what is being uncovered here. If that is you, let those 3 words stand as a signal. And if you want to say more, say more. What is the name of someone you have lost? What is the question about death that you have never been able to fully answer? What is the part of your own life that feels unfinished? The comment section for this video is not a performance space. It is a threshold of its own. And every honest word written there is part of the same current this video is trying to follow. The book we have been circling is known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Its original title in Tibetan is the Bardo Thodol, and this title translates with striking precision to Liberation Through Hearing in the Intermediate State. Read that again slowly. Liberation through hearing in the intermediate state. The title itself is a map. It tells you what kind of experience death is understood to be in this tradition. Not a solid wall, not a destination, but a state of transition, a passage, an intermediate condition in which the quality of awareness and what that awareness is exposed to determines what happens next. This text is believed within its own tradition to have originated with Padmasambhava, an 8th century tantric master of extraordinary influence, sometimes called Guru Rinpoche, meaning the precious teacher. According to tradition, Padmasambhava composed these teachings but concluded that the Tibetans of his era were not yet prepared to receive them, so he hid the texts, encoding them as what are called dharma, or treasure teachings, buried within the landscape of Tibet itself, to be discovered at the appropriate moment by a person of sufficient spiritual capacity. This practice of hidden treasure teachings, concealed until the right time and the right finder, is itself a profound symbolic statement. Some knowledge can only be received when the receiver is ready. You do not find the teaching finds you. The texts were eventually discovered in the 14th century by a young Tibetan adept named Karma Lingpa, who is said to have unearthed them from a hillside. They were then transmitted, interpreted, and eventually entered the global conversation in 1927, when an American scholar named Walter Evans Wentz published the first English translation, giving it the now famous name, The Tibetan Book of the Dead. The great Swiss psychologist Carl Jung wrote a psychological commentary for a later edition, recognizing in the Bardo teachings a map of the inner world that he found remarkably convergent with his own explorations of the unconscious. When two such radically different streams of inquiry, one ancient Eastern spiritual practice and one modern Western depth psychology, begin pointing at the same interior terrain, that is worth pausing to notice. The central framework of the Bardo Thodol is the concept of the Bardo, which can be understood as an intermediate state, a between condition, a passage zone. The text identifies several Bardos, and here is where its teaching becomes far more radical than most readers initially expect. The Bardos are not confined to the afterlife. They include the Bardo of waking life, the Bardo of dreaming, the Bardo of deep sleep, the Bardo of meditation, the Bardo of dying, and the Bardo of what follows death. In other words, the text is not describing a process that begins when you stop breathing. It is describing a process that you are already inside of right now. Your daily life is itself a kind of intermediate state, a passage between an arrival you did not choose and a departure you cannot avoid. The first major threshold the Bardo Thodol describes is what it calls the Chikai Bardo, the Bardo of the moment of death. This is the stage in which, according to the teachings, a brilliant luminosity arises, a clear light, pure, open, boundless awareness that is described as the nature of consciousness itself. This light is not something external arriving from outside. It is what consciousness is when all the overlays, the stories, the identities, the fears, the attachments are stripped away. The teachings say that if the dying person recognizes this clear light, recognizes it as their own awareness and not as something frightening or foreign, they are liberated in that instant. The crossing is complete before it has barely begun. But most people do not recognize it. Most people flinch. Most people experience the vast openness as terrifying rather than as home. And the reason, according to this tradition, is that they have spent an entire life running from open, unmediated awareness. They have filled every silence with distraction, every empty moment with entertainment or noise. They have never trained themselves to sit inside pure, structureless awareness and simply let it be. So when death strips away all the structures, all the familiar anchors, all the identities and narratives that said who they were, what remains feels alien rather than familiar. And the mind, out of habit, recoils. After the clear light of the Chikai Bardo, the teachings describe the Chonyid Bardo, the Bardo of the experiencing of reality. This is where visions arise, elaborate, symbolic, intensely vivid appearances that the text describes with remarkable specificity. Peaceful deities appear first. Luminous figures of extraordinary beauty and light, each associated with a particular aspect of wisdom. And accompanying each peaceful deity is a much dimmer light, a dull, familiar, ordinary-seeming glow. The teaching is uncompromising here. The brilliant light is your own liberated awareness reflecting itself back. The dull light is the pull of old conditioning, old habits, old karmic patterns. And the mind that has spent a lifetime choosing comfort over clarity will, in that moment, be drawn toward the dim light. Not because it is better, but because it is familiar. As the days in the Bardo progress, the peaceful deities give way to wrathful deities. Terrifying figures, blazing with fire and wrath, appearing to the dead. And here, the teaching delivers one of its most psychologically incisive instructions. These wrathful visions are not enemies coming from outside. They are the same energies as the peaceful deities, wearing a different face. The terror is not other. It is the shadow of your own nature, meeting you in a form your unresolved fears have given it. If you can recognize this, if you can see through the terrifying appearance to the underlying energy and remain still, the liberation is still possible. But if you run from the wrathful visions, you continue descending through the Bardo into the realm where consciousness begins seeking another form, another life, another beginning from which the whole cycle will restart. What makes this ancient map so psychologically compelling is not only its symbolic beauty, but its precise attention to the way consciousness loses its familiar ground. The Bardo Thodol describes the dying process as a sequential dissolution, and this dissolution follows a specific order that resonates deeply with what we understand experientially and philosophically about the relationship between the body and the mind. The process does not simply stop. It unravels, layer by layer, from the most physical to the most subtle. And what the mind encounters at each stage of that unraveling is determined, to a significant degree, by what the mind has been training itself to meet throughout a lifetime. In the earliest stages of the dissolution described in these teachings, the physical body begins losing its coherence. The gross elements, earth, water, fire, and air, are understood as dissolving into one another. What this may correspond to experientially is the progressive loss of physical sensation and control, the sense of solidity giving way, the warmth leaving the extremities, the breath becoming something the body no longer orchestrates with its usual automaticity. The body, which has been the anchor of identity for an entire lifetime, begins to release its hold. And for a consciousness that has located itself almost entirely in the body, in physical sensation, in the appearance it presented to the world, this release is profoundly disorienting. The anchor is going, the harbor is disappearing, and the awareness that was housed inside the body is left suspended in something that has no walls. Then the subtler layers begin to dissolve. The nervous system, which has spent decades scanning for threat and reward, which has encoded every significant emotional experience, every trauma, every longing, every pattern of approach and avoidance, this system is no longer receiving its usual data. The familiar inputs from the world, the sight of faces, the sound of voices, the pressure of surfaces begin to fade. And what fills the space is not emptiness. It is the interior. The mind, suddenly without its usual stream of external input to process, begins to project from within. This is a key idea in the Bardo teachings. The mind does not simply go blank. It produces. It generates visions from the accumulated energy of everything it has been, everything it has feared, everything it has loved, everything it has refused to look at directly. This is where the body-mind connection reveals its deepest implications, because the nervous system does not carry only memories in the way we commonly think of memories as neat, retrievable files. It carries emotional charges, residues of experience that were never fully processed, grief that was felt but never completed, anger that was suppressed rather than understood, love that was felt but never fully expressed. These are not abstract psychological concepts. They are actual patterns encoded in the tissue of the nervous system, waiting, and the death process, according to these teachings, is a moment when all of that accumulated interior energy surfaces simultaneously, without the usual defenses and distractions available to moderate it. This is why the tradition emphasizes so strongly the importance of how you have lived, not in a moralistic or punitive sense, not as a cosmic ledger of good and bad deeds waiting to be tallied, but in a deeply practical, psychological sense. The mind in the Bardo meets what the mind has been. It encounters the residue of its own habitual patterns. The person who has spent decades learning to sit with fear rather than flee it, to stay present rather than distract, to see clearly rather than project, that person meets the dissolution of the Bardo with a different quality of awareness than the person who has spent decades running from every uncomfortable interior signal. The Bardo is not imposing something foreign on the consciousness. It is holding up the consciousness to itself. And this speaks directly to one of the most provocative psychological insights embedded in the Bardo Thodol. The visions the dying consciousness encounters are not external events. They are mind. They are the projection of the mind's own nature and content onto the screen of the Bardo. This is a concept that Carl Jung recognized immediately when he encountered the text. He described it as a profound map of the unconscious, a description of how the psyche encounters its own archetypes when the normal scaffolding of waking consciousness is removed. Whether you approach this as literal spiritual truth, as psychological metaphor, or as both simultaneously, the underlying point holds. What you meet in the deepest moments of altered consciousness is not something coming from outside you. It is what you carry inside you becoming visible. This also reframes the significance of sleep, which the Bardo Thodol explicitly includes in its taxonomy of Bardos. Every night, as the body releases its waking control and the nervous system moves into sleep, there is a small dissolution, a temporary letting go of the ordinary anchors of identity. Dreams arise from the same interior field that the death visions are said to arise from. And the quality of that nightly experience, whether it is chaotic and fear-driven or spacious and aware, is itself a practice. It is a rehearsal. The ancient teachers were not being merely metaphorical when they described sleep as a small death and waking as a small rebirth. They were describing a genuine structural correspondence that the nervous system enacts every single night, and that most people move through entirely unconsciously, never noticing what they might be training. The body also signals long before death arrives what the nervous system is holding in its deepest layers. Chronic tightening in the chest around certain thoughts. The way the shoulders carry grief they have never been given language for. The constriction in the throat when there is something that needs to be said but has not been said. These are not decorative metaphors. They are real patterns of stored energy, real signatures of what the nervous system has been quietly carrying for years. The ancient understanding of the death process as a bodily dissolution implies that all of this stored material does not simply evaporate. It is present at the threshold, and the mind that has learned to listen to the body's signals while alive, to hear the subtle interior language of what is being held and what needs to be released, is a mind that has already begun the preparation that these ancient teachings describe as essential. Here is the first thing the Bardo Thodol is really teaching, and it is not what most people expect. The central teaching of this ancient death guide is not a description of another world. It is not a travel itinerary for the afterlife. It is a teaching about recognition. The word that appears again and again in the text, in instruction after instruction spoken to the dying and the dead, is recognize. Recognize this, know this, see what this is. The entire architecture of the Bardo teachings rests on a single question. Will the awareness recognize itself when it finally meets itself without disguise? This is the recognition the clear light of the Chikai Bardo demands, not recognition of something new. Recognition of something that was always there. The nature of your own awareness, boundless and open, has been present every moment of your life. But in life, it was always covered, always wrapped in the overlay of identity, belief, narrative, preference, desire, and fear. Death strips all of that away. And what is left is what you always were. The question is whether you have ever paused long enough, looked honestly enough, sat quietly enough to have any familiarity with that open space. Because if you have not, you will not recognize it when it appears in its full and unmediated intensity. This is the first micro-revelation that the Bardo Thodol offers. Awakening is not a destination, it is a recognition. And the practice of recognizing awareness in life, in meditation, in silence, in the moments when you stop performing and simply observe what is here, that practice is the direct preparation for the most radical recognition this tradition describes. The ancient teachers did not separate spiritual practice from death preparation. They understood them as the same thing. You learn to recognize awareness now. You learn to rest in open, unmediated presence now, not so that you can win a cosmic prize later, but because recognition is the threshold itself, and every moment of genuine awareness in this life is a crossing of that threshold in miniature. The Bardo Thodol is not asking you to believe anything you cannot verify. It is asking you to look, to observe your own mind, to notice what it runs from, to notice when the space gets too open and the mind fills it with noise, to notice the difference between a mind that can rest in uncertainty and a mind that compulsively reaches for the next anchor. Because that noticing, right now, in your daily life, is not separate from what this ancient book is pointing toward. It is the beginning of the crossing. It is already the practice. You do not have to be dying to encounter death. You have already encountered it many times, in forms so familiar you may not have recognized them for what they were. Every significant ending in your life has been a small death. The end of a relationship that shaped who you thought you were. The moment a version of your future collapsed and you had to construct a new one. The death of a role you had played so long you had confused it with your actual identity. Parent, partner, professional. The person who has it together. The person who does not need help. When those roles end or fracture, something that felt like you, that felt permanent and solid, simply stops. And in that stopping, if you were paying attention, you may have felt a cold, bottomless sensation that was not only grief. It was a signal pointing towards something much older and much more fundamental than the immediate loss. Sleep is a small death that happens every night and that almost no one treats as a teacher. But the tradition we have been exploring treats it as exactly that. Every time you lose waking consciousness, every time the familiar narrator in your head goes quiet, every time the sense of being a specific person in a specific body with specific concerns dissolves into the darkness of sleep, you are rehearsing. You are touching the edge of the same dissolution the Bardo Thodol describes at the moment of death. And how do you meet that dissolution? With anxiety about tomorrow? With a phone screen as a buffer between wakefulness and the void? With medication that flattens the transition into unconsciousness? Or with some capacity to let go? The quality of that nightly letting go is itself a mirror. Grief is perhaps the most vivid small death available to those who are still living. Because grief does not only mourn the person who died, it mourns the world that existed when that person was in it. It mourns the version of you that existed in relationship to them. Grief is the mind and body encountering the irreversible. Something that cannot be undone, cannot be recalled, cannot be negotiated. And the way a person moves through grief, whether they allow the current of it to move all the way through, or whether they harden against it, distract from it, medicate it away, or intellectualize it into something manageable. This is a direct reflection of their relationship to impermanence, which is to say, their relationship to death itself. There is also the subtler form of small death that happens every time a belief you held about yourself is dissolved by reality. Every time you discover you were wrong about something you were certain of. Every time life shows you that the story you have been telling about yourself does not hold. These moments of ego dissolution, however minor they may seem, are doorways. They are invitations to step across a threshold and see something you could not see before. But the defended self does not generally welcome these invitations. It argues, it explains, it restructures the story to preserve the familiar sense of who it is. And in doing so, it practices the same reflex that, according to the Bardo teachings, causes the consciousness to miss the clear light at the moment of death. The reflex of reaching back for the familiar rather than resting in the open. Silence is another threshold most people avoid. The kind of silence that is not merely the absence of sound, but the absence of distraction. The kind that falls when you stop reaching for the next stimulus and simply stay with what is already here. Many people cannot bear that silence for more than a few moments before the hand moves toward a screen, before the mind generates its own noise to fill the space. But that silence is precisely where the recognition the Bardo teachings describe begins to become available. In the silence, you stop being the performer of your life and begin to be the one who observes it. You begin to touch what is beneath the narrator. And beneath the narrator is the same awareness that the clear light of the Bardo is described as revealing. The same light, available right now, in this room, in this silence, if you can stay with it. The fear of love is Perhaps more than anything else, the clearest sign of death anxiety living inside an ordinary life. When you hold back from loving fully because loss is inevitable, when you keep relationships at a managed distance to protect yourself from the devastation of losing them, when you build walls around your tenderness because tenderness feels dangerous, you are obeying the fear of death without knowing it, because the root of that holding back is the knowledge, felt somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that everything ends, that connection is temporary, that the very depth of love makes loss unbearable. And rather than face that truth and love anyway, many people choose the smaller, safer version of love, the version with enough distance built in that the eventual loss will not destroy them. This is death anxiety, not wearing the face of fear, wearing the face of caution. Every time you defer living fully to some future moment, every time you say, "I will do the important thing later, when conditions are better, when I am more ready, when I have more time," you are also responding to death anxiety. Because the deferral is not only about laziness or circumstance, it is about a subtle unwillingness to be fully in the moment, which would require acknowledging that this moment is finite, that the number of moments remaining is not unlimited, that later may not come in the form you are imagining. The ancient death teachings are not asking you to be dramatic about this. They are asking you to be honest. And honesty about impermanence is the single most corrective lens available to a human life. Each of these small deaths, the endings, the grief, the ego dissolution, the silence, the deferred love, the deferred life, all of them carry the same hidden lesson. The same ancient current runs through all of them. They are invitations to practice the recognition, to practice resting in the open rather than contracting back into the familiar, to practice seeing clearly rather than defending a story. The Bardo Thodol does not begin at the final breath. It begins in the choices you make right now about whether to meet your experience with open awareness or with defended avoidance. Right now is where the ancient teaching lives. If this exploration of death, consciousness, and the hidden patterns beneath ordinary life is speaking to something real in you, then subscribe to the hidden current. Not because you need another notification to ignore, but because this channel is a sustained journey into exactly this territory. The invisible forces shaping your mind, your awareness, your identity, and your inner life. Each video opens another section of the archive. Each one goes further into what most people never pause long enough to look at. If you want to keep descending into this current, subscribe now, and the next time we open something, you will be there when it happens. This is not a channel for people who want comfortable answers. This is a channel for people who can feel the weight of the deeper questions and are no longer willing to look away. If that is who you are, then you belong here. Subscribe and stay with this. The cost of refusing to look at mortality is not paid in some distant future at the moment of death. It is paid now. It is paid in the texture of daily life. It is paid in the numbing of experience, the reduction of aliveness, the progressive narrowing of the world as the person unconsciously arranges their life to minimize any contact with the feelings that impermanence produces. The avoidance of death is the avoidance of life. These are not two separate avoidances. They are one. And the person who has structured their existence around never feeling the full weight of impermanence is also, by necessity, someone who never feels the full weight of joy, of love, of presence. The person who is unconsciously controlled by death anxiety is often very difficult to identify from the outside because the adaptations look like reasonable behavior. They work hard, very hard, often because busyness is the most socially acceptable form of distraction available. They accumulate things, not because the things bring genuine satisfaction, but because acquisition creates a temporary sense of permanence. They seek status because status feels like a kind of immortality, a way of mattering that might outlast the body. They argue and defend and refuse to admit error because acknowledging limitation is too close to acknowledging mortality. All of these behaviors look like ambition, or prudence, or confidence, or strength. But underneath them, running quietly like a current beneath a calm surface, is the unacknowledged certainty that everything ends and the desperate refusal to feel what that means. The relationships that death anxiety quietly damages are perhaps the most painful part of its cost. Because the person who is afraid of loss keeps love at a managed distance. They are present but not fully present, engaged but not fully open. They participate in love while maintaining an interior exit door, a reservation, a held-back portion of themselves that they have decided will not be given because it cannot afford to be taken away. And the people who love them feel this, even if they cannot name it. They feel the glass wall. They feel the warmth that stops just short of full contact. They feel chosen, but not fully received. And over time, this emotional rationing corrodes connection in ways that accumulate slowly and devastatingly. There is also the cost in time. The years given to things that genuinely do not matter, not because the person cannot identify what matters, but because fully engaging with what matters would require a presence and a vulnerability that the defended self has decided it cannot afford. The creative project never started because starting it would mean risking failure, and failure would mean confronting inadequacy. And confronting inadequacy too often feels adjacent to confronting mortality. The relationship never repaired because repairing it would mean being seen in the admission of wrongness, and being seen that completely feels too close to the kind of exposure that death represents. The conversation never had because having it would open something that might not be containable. All of this avoided. All of it deferred. The cost accumulating silently beneath the surface of ordinary days. And then there is the cost in anger. The quiet, chronic anger of the person who has not given themselves permission to live fully. It is not always visible as anger. Sometimes it looks like cynicism, a reflexive dismissal of anything that might require genuine feeling. Sometimes it looks like contempt for people who are more openly emotional, who love more extravagantly, who express more freely. Because the person who has locked their own tenderness away in the service of self-protection often cannot tolerate watching someone else move through the world with a more open heart. The open heart is both an indictment and a reminder of what was chosen against. And so it is dismissed or diminished. And the anger behind the dismissal is the grief that was never given its proper form. The ancient death teachings do not moralize about any of this. They do not shame the person who avoids the threshold. They simply describe with extraordinary precision what happens to a consciousness that approaches the final moment carrying unresolved attachment, unresolved fear, and unresolved avoidance. And the description is the invitation. Because once you see the pattern clearly, once you feel the weight of what the avoidance actually costs in this life, not only in the hypothetical afterlife, the question of whether to continue paying that cost becomes a live question, not an abstract one, a real and immediate one, which is exactly where the ancient teaching wants you to be. Here is the turn. The moment where everything described as threat becomes teacher. Death is not your enemy. It has never been your enemy. It has been the most honest presence in your life, the only force in your experience that has never lied to you about what ultimately matters. Every other force in your world can be negotiated, deferred, compromised with, or distracted from. Death cannot. And this absolute quality, which is what makes it so terrifying, is also what makes it so valuable. Because a teacher that cannot be bought, bargained with, or ignored is the rarest kind. It is the only teacher that cannot afford to spare your comfort. The ancient traditions that built their teachings around death did not do so out of morbidity. They did not dwell on death because they were fascinated with suffering. They dwelt on it because they understood that awareness of mortality is the single most effective solvent for self-deception available to a human being. When you hold your own finitude clearly in your awareness, not as an abstract concept, but as a felt reality, the noise falls away. The trivial arguments that consume months of energy suddenly look trivial. The relationships that matter suddenly feel urgent and precious. The creative urgency that fear has been suppressing suddenly has access to the open air. Mortality is not the enemy of meaning, it is the engine of meaning. There is a quality of tenderness that only appears in the presence of impermanence. The cherry blossom is beautiful in a particular way, not despite the fact that it falls in days, but because of it. The understanding that this moment, this face, this light, this conversation will not return in exactly this form gives everything a sharpness and a preciousness that comfort and permanence cannot produce. People who have had near-death experiences often describe returning to the world with an almost painful intensity of perception. The color of leaves, the sound of voices, the warmth of ordinary human contact, all of it radically amplified because the assumption of unlimited time has been stripped away and replaced with the truth of this moment's singularity. That intensity is not a side effect of having nearly died. It is what life feels like when mortality is no longer being suppressed. The reversal that the Bardo teachings offer is not a comfort. It is a restructuring. It asks you to stop treating death as the thing that takes life away from you, and to start recognizing it as the thing that gives life its weight and its edge and its invitation to be fully inhabited. The person who lives with the awareness of death is not more depressed than the person who avoids it. They are, paradoxically, more alive. Because they are making choices from a place of full information. They know the window is finite, and finite windows change what you do with the light. This is not a new idea. It runs through nearly every serious philosophical and spiritual tradition in recorded history. The Stoics of ancient Rome maintained the practice of memento mori, the deliberate contemplation of death, precisely because they understood that mortality brings clarity. The Buddhist traditions built meditation on impermanence into their foundational practices for the same reason. The ancient Egyptians surrounded themselves with symbols of death not out of despair, but out of a desire to remain in honest relationship with the full arc of existence. Across these radically different cultures and centuries, the same insight kept emerging. When you stop avoiding the ending, you begin to truly inhabit the middle. Death is the reframe. It is the lens that corrects distorted vision. And the Bardo Thodol finally is a love letter written in the language of absolute honesty. It says to you, you will face a crossing. You will face it alone in the sense that no one can make the crossing for you. And what you bring to that crossing is what your awareness has been training for in every moment of this life. This is not a threat. It is an invitation. The most serious and the most compassionate invitation imaginable. Begin now. Recognize now. Live deliberately now. Not because death is waiting around the corner with a ledger, but because you are already alive, and that fact is more extraordinary than most people ever stop long enough to feel. The teachings of the Bardo Thodol are not only philosophical. They are practical. They imply a set of genuine interior practices that any person can take up right now without subscribing to any particular religious belief, without adopting a new identity, without performing spirituality for an audience. The first of these is the practice of contemplating impermanence directly, not morbidly, not obsessively, but honestly and regularly. This means holding in awareness, at least occasionally, in a deliberate way, the fact that you will die, that the people you love will die, that this particular configuration of life and relationship and opportunity is temporary. Sit with that fact. Let it be real. Let it have weight in your body and not only in your abstract thoughts. Notice what changes in your priorities when you actually allow that truth to land. The second practice is forgiveness, and it is more urgent than most people realize. The Bardo teachings imply in their description of what the dying consciousness carries into the threshold that unresolved relational harm is among the heaviest material a consciousness can be burdened with. This is not about religious guilt. It is about the simple psychological truth that resentment, held long enough, becomes architecture. It shapes how you think, how you feel, how you perceive other people, how much energy is available for genuine living. Forgiving does not mean deciding that what was done to you was acceptable. It means choosing not to carry the weight of it in your nervous system any longer. It means releasing a held charge that was never yours to keep permanently. The urgency here comes from the recognition that you may not have unlimited time to complete this release. The unforgiving word has a way of becoming the last word. The third practice is releasing attachment. And this is perhaps the subtlest and the most demanding. Releasing attachment does not mean becoming cold or indifferent to the people and things you love. It means learning to love without clenching, learning to hold connection without demanding that it remain exactly as it is forever. The Bardo Thodol describes the Sidpa Bardo, the Bardo of rebirth, as a state in which consciousness is pulled back into another cycle primarily by the force of attachment and craving. Whether you understand this literally or metaphorically, the psychological insight is real. Attachment that has never been examined tends to become compulsive, and compulsive attachment to the impermanent produces a particular quality of suffering that is both chronic and invisible, because it looks like love while functioning more like a grip. The fourth practice is learning to observe fear without obeying it. Fear is one of the most powerful forces in the human nervous system. And the death teachings make clear that fear is the primary force that causes the consciousness to miss the clear light, to flinch from the peaceful deities, and to flee from the wrathful visions in the Bardo. This is not because fear is evil. It is because unexamined fear is reflexive. It moves before awareness can respond. The practice of observing fear, of turning toward it with curiosity rather than immediately acting from it, of asking what this fear is protecting and what it costs you to obey it without question. This practice builds the same quality of awareness that the Bardo teachings describe as essential. You are not trying to eliminate fear. You are learning to be the one who watches fear rather than the one who is simply carried by it. The fifth practice is the practice of living deliberately. This means making regular, honest contact with the question, is this how I want to be spending the time I have? Not in a way that generates constant anxiety or self-judgment, but in a way that keeps the finite window in view. The practice of deliberate living is simply the practice of not sleepwalking, of not deferring indefinitely, of noticing when you are living at half volume because full volume seems too risky or too demanding, and choosing to turn it up anyway. One practical form of this is asking at intervals, what would I regret not having done or said if this year were my last? And then paying attention to the answer rather than filing it away. The sixth practice is recognizing what must be completed. Every person carries something unfinished that they know at some level needs to be addressed before they are truly free to live and eventually to die with integrity. For some people, it is a conversation that has not been had. For others, it is a creative work that has been deferred. For others still, it is an act of repair towards someone who was wronged, or an honest admission to themselves about who they are and what they actually want. The Bardo Thodol implies that the consciousness which arrives at the threshold of death, carrying the greatest weight of incompleteness, is the most disoriented in the Bardo. This is not a punishment. It is a natural consequence. Begin completing what needs to be completed, not because death is arriving tomorrow, but because the completion itself is part of the life. It is the life becoming whole. The final revelation of the Bardo Thodol is not about the afterlife at all, or rather, it is about the afterlife only, insofar as the afterlife is a mirror of this life. The ancient teachers were not primarily in the business of theology. They were in the business of transformation. They described the Bardo, the after-death state, with such precision and such psychological depth, not because they wanted to map a geography that no one could verify, but because they wanted to hold a mirror to the living. Because every description of the Bardo state is simultaneously a description of what the unexamined life already looks like from the inside. The running from vast open awareness, the clinging to familiar patterns, the flinching from the brilliant light, the choosing of the dim familiar glow over the terrifying radiance of what you actually are. This is not only a description of what may happen after death, it is a description of what is already happening right now in the daily life of a consciousness that has not yet woken up to itself. The real question the Bardo Thodol leaves you with is not, what happens after I die? The real question is, how am I dying right now? How am I missing the clear light of my own awareness right now? How am I choosing the familiar and the comfortable over the open and the true? How am I obeying old patterns as if they were reality, rather than recognizing them as projections of the mind? How am I flinching from the silence that would let me meet myself? These are not comfortable questions. They are not designed to be. They are the questions of an ancient archive that has been waiting for exactly the kind of awareness that can sit with them without running. The text is called Liberation Through Hearing. Liberation through hearing, not through believing, not through joining, not through performing devotion to the correct doctrines, through hearing, through the quality of attention you bring to what is being revealed. The ancient teachers understood that the capacity to genuinely hear something, to let it move through the defended surface of the familiar mind and actually land in awareness, is itself a form of liberation. You are doing that right now. Sitting with a teaching that most people deflect, avoid, or dismiss. Staying with the weight of it. Feeling the relevance of it in your own experience. That attention is not nothing. It is the beginning of the crossing. And so the final revelation is this. The ancient book is not asking whether you believe in its cosmology. It is asking whether you are already living like someone conscious of the final threshold. It is asking whether your choices, your attention, your relationships, your love, your use of the finite time available reflect an awareness of what is ultimately at stake. Not in a fearful way, not in a way that produces paralysis or despair, but in a way that produces the particular quality of full engagement that only becomes possible when the pretense of unlimited time is finally, honestly laid down. Here is the question I want you to carry with you and to answer in the comments below. What is it about death that you fear most? Is it the possibility of non-existence? Is it the thought of a final judgment of how you lived? Is it the thought of leaving behind the people you love most before you are ready? Before you have said what needs to be said? Or is it the fear of arriving at the threshold with the feeling that your life was not fully inhabited? There is no wrong answer. Every honest answer is a signal from the deepest layer of your awareness, and it deserves to be heard. Write it below. And if someone in your life thinks deeply about these questions, about what it means to be alive, about what comes after, share this video with them. Not to disturb them, but because some conversations are worth having before the silence makes them impossible. This video was built for the kind of mind that is willing to go somewhere uncomfortable in search of something true. If that is you, and if this opens something, let it be known. The hidden current runs in many directions, and every honest voice in the comment section below is part of the same stream. There is one moment every human being is moving toward, the final breath, the silence after the body stops. And we have now looked inside that moment long enough to see what the ancient teachers saw. That it is not an abyss. It is a mirror. And what appears in that mirror is not foreign. It is everything you have been, everything you have carried, and everything you chose or refused to face while the body was still breathing. The ancient book was written for that moment. But it was also written for this one. For the moment right now when you are still here. When the breath is still moving. When the mirror is still available. And when the crossing, in its many small daily forms, is still something you can choose to make consciously. What if death is not the end of the story? What if it is the final chapter that makes the meaning of all the preceding chapters clear? What if the way you meet the small deaths already present in your life, the endings, the grief, the silences, the moments when identity dissolves and something more fundamental remains? What if those moments are not interruptions to your life, but are the life itself, asking to be recognized? The hidden current has always been moving beneath the surface, beneath the noise, beneath the performance, beneath the fear. What the ancient book reveals is not a new territory. It is the one you have always been standing in. The threshold is not somewhere ahead of you. It is here. And awareness of it is not a burden. It is the most honest form of being alive there is.